Alright, the Game Boy Light. What is the Game Boy Light, guys?
Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Yeah, that's right. I'm seeing nothing. Nintendo, fix this. I'm legally blind. Well, wouldn't you know, they did. This
He actually is colorblind, I think. It's surprising.
right here
But I also have my own struggles. Game Boy Light.
is the Game Boy Light, probably the least known revision of the original Game Boy line. Of course, judging by this box, you can probably tell it only released in Japan, and I remember when I first heard about this thing back in like the late 2000s, I think. I kind of thought like, oh, Game Boy Light? That must be like a Nintendo DS Lite kind of thing. It is kind of strange.
Bro, I've never heard of this thing though, guys. Really, I've been following like what Nintendo's been doing for a while. Past year and never even heard of this, guys. Wow.
Strange when you look back how the Game Boy and the DS both had revisions subtitled Light, but they were spelled completely differently.
Like literally, part of me thinks they're making this after, in the present day. Like it's not even vintage because I just don't find out about it. But that's not the case, guys. I don't think it is. Might be.
And they both meant pretty much different things. So to talk the Game Boy Light, we gotta talk about the entire history of the Game Boy. And we can't talk about the entire history of the Game Boy without starting with the Crusades.
No, I'm glad it's not. I'm glad it's not going through the entire history, guys. Because then it'll be like a 40-minute video. Thank you for the sub on YouTube.
And that leads us to Nintendo releasing the Game Boy in 1989. So, the original Game Boy was the ugliest popular kid I've ever seen in my life. It's pretty crazy looking back at sales numbers, and it does truly show that what really matters at the end.
I don't even remember if I had this version of the Game Boy, but I do know if I had the Game Boy Color, man. So much fun growing up playing that, man. And you grew up nowadays, it's so much different.
End of the day is price point, accessibility, and games.
And that's good because partially good because I was so bored growing up, man. No phone.
Have all three of those, or at least like two of them, I think, to really, come out on top in the market. Because you look back at the Game Boy's competition with the Sega Game Gear and Atari Lynx, and I think everybody will look back at those and they'll say like, oh, well, the Game Boy did much better because it had a great battery life and it was cheap. I would also argue it had games people wanted to play, because I don't think anybody gave a damn about what was on Game Gear or Atari Lynx. Of course, there are some
Really, I did not know a single person that had a Game Gear or Atari Lynx.
freaks out there. Yeah, there are good games on those platforms, but nothing that special. It's not like anybody's actively seeking out a Game Gear to really play like a Game Gear hidden gem, like a game that's like, oh my god, this is Game Gear right here. I mean, like, you could get by with a Game Gear. There's some decent games on there, but it was nothing compared to.
This is like 30-year-old technology, guys. Literally as old as me. I think it got released around when I was born.
Game Boy. I mean, Mario Land 1 and 2, Link's Awakening, and then later on we had Pokemon, we had Tetris at the launch bundled in, and all the third-party support. It was insane. This thing had a crazy library, and it's still fun to go back to. Original Game Boy games just have this charm to them that I just can't get enough of. I love going back and just fiddling around with some old Game Boy games. I find them far more interesting than a lot of stuff on NES.
I actually recently completed that game.
Yes. It's probably because like I'm kind of burnt out
This game's pretty fun.
on old NES games. For like 20 years there, the only thing people would talk about when it came to like old games was the garbage on NES. And I'm just like, listen, I think we're past that at this point. What else is there to say? Let's talk about the Game Boy if we're gonna talk about old shit from the 80s and 90s. Because it's so much more fun. You know, it's not fun. Everything else about it. This
Man, we haven't even seen the Game Boy Light yet.
thing is one of the biggest pieces of trash to use. The screen is
It is not, bro.
abysmal on it. It's
You can play games just fine on it.
usable, but I don't really think that's a pro. And would you believe for like 6 years, Nintendo just kept this design around. This original brick was pretty much just the Game Boy for half a decade. But then thankfully, Nintendo updated the unit with the Game Boy Pocket. This is a much more modern feeling Game Boy, obviously, with its smaller design.
No, not Game Boy Advance SP. Best one there. Best one out, man. Yeah, nice like design, bro. You didn't have to worry about like breaking your freaking stuff with these devices, guys. Like the screen, they would never break. I think because it's not a touchscreen, and the clamshell design. Touchscreens seem a lot easier to break, especially when it's just like, you know, the touchscreen is just one side of the phone.
Design, both in terms of just, you know, the face region and the thickness. I mean, this thing is truly pocket-sized. It's so much more easy to move around with this. I will say it's probably a little less comfortable. I don't mind it though. I think it feels still pretty good in the hands. But one of the big things was the screen. The screen is so much better on here. Still not ideal. It's not color. It's not backlit, but it's so much easier to see things going on.
Yeah, I was about to say, there's no way that was actually made that way. How they even yes, they made this animation somehow 30 years ago.
The original Game Boy had a problem with like ghosting, where like the screen would just kind of like get a little blurry when stuff was going on. This one, pretty crystal clear. But like I said, no backlight, no color, none of that. And it's not like this wasn't a thing that could happen. I mean, the Game Gear and Atari Lynx both had color, lit screens. So obviously Nintendo was just being a cheap ass here. Well, at least in North America. So let's talk the Game Boy Light. In 1998, Nintendo released this in Japan, and it's pretty much a very...
Well, why do they always release stuff in Japan that the USA doesn't get?
similar beast to the Game Boy Pocket in terms of aesthetics. You see, for the most part, it's very similar. You know, we have a couple little differences. The Nintendo logo is concave compared to convex on here. The start and select buttons are raised on here compared to printed on here. And then, you know, the A and B buttons are on the buttons itself rather than right there. And it's an overall slightly bigger unit, but I think that actually benefits.
To make the comparison, like, you know what I mean? They're just updating like a video game like Fortnite, making it better as time goes on.
It a bit. I think if I've heard anybody say anything bad about the Game Boy Pocket is that it's a little too small, it's a little too squared off, it's a little hard to hold sometimes. The Game Boy Light, I mean, that's an ass. Definitely a bit more comfortable to hold. This battery cover, having that ridge there, does kind of make it like a pretty nice handheld to hold in your hands and play. So it's pretty much just an alternate reality Game Boy Pocket. What sets this apart? Well, yeah, let's get this out of the way and let's see that damn light. It's on. So the Game Boy Light does have a backlight, but this
Early version of the SP, guys. And this was before a Game Boy Color, by the way.
backlight is a pretty interesting one. It's pretty much just
Maybe it isn't, I don't know.
here so then you can play at nighttime. During the day, this thing doesn't do a damn thing. It is so hard to see in the middle of the day when you're already under a fair amount of light. Now, to be fair,
For real?
that makes sense. You can already kind of see the screen when there's a lot of lights, so whatever. But I mean,
Oh my goodness.
that just shows how rudimentary this original backlit screen was compared to something like a Game Boy Advance SP. I mean,
This is probably my favorite Game Boy game, though, not gonna lie.
Like, it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of the day. Compare playing a Game Boy Advance SP to an original Game Boy Advance. The screen is just so much easier to see with that light. That light actually does a damn thing. This one, it only really makes sense when you're playing in the dark, which is hugely beneficial. You remember playing
But it has you can turn the backlight on and off.
your Game
I just
Boy
want to see a side-by-side comparison, guys. That's all I want to see.
in the back seat of the car on a car ride home at like 9 p.m. at night, and you try to go hit the light on the ceiling of the car, and then your dad's like, get away from that! Yeah, no more worrying about that. You can actually see your damn Game Boy now. So this does have a purpose, but it came out at genuinely the worst possible time. 1998 for this bad boy. Why does that year sound familiar? Are you really gonna see this on the shelf and then go, oh boy, I can't wait to play
Guys, now we know why they only released it in Japan.
Alleyway at 10 p.m. Yeah, this literally came out like 4, 5, 6 months, pretty much half a year before the Game Boy Color released in Japan, 1998. Yeah, why would you buy this? I mean, to be fair, this did offer, you know, like a backlight. This didn't. But at the same time, you know, it's a Game Boy Color. I mean, I guess it makes sense from like a business point of view.
You would not be able to play Game Boy Color games on that Game Boy Light, by the way. They made it incompatible, I think. Maybe not.
You know, you can offer 2 different Game Boys that excel at 2 different things. So maybe you might end up buying both.
As these devices, the DS, the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Advance SP, all of them had like headphone jacks, and I did not use them at all, man. I probably annoyed everyone I grew up with.
I know I did, but I don't think most consumers fell for that trap. I think they just went, oh, a Game Boy with a light, that's fun. I'll just get the new Game Boy. And the backlight itself is just pretty weak. You know, it does what it's meant to do, which is nice, but it makes this more of a weird, cool novelty to own as like a collector or just like
Basically.
a big Game Boy fan, and pretty much for no other reason. Hey, the battery life is really good. It's like 20 hours without the backlight, 12 hours with it. The Game Boy...
I'm sure that's what they're thinking when they made it, like a limited run of it. I don't know. Maybe not. Anything they put out is like, you know, collectors.
Games look really nice on it. The backlight's like this kind of weird color, this weird kind of green, but hey, whatever. It does its job well. But it'll go down in history as one of the most poorly timed console revisions out there. There's only a couple variants of this thing. There's like a few special edition ones, but you're mainly just gonna find like the 2 main colors they released, silver and gold. To anybody looking for the ultimate original Game Boy, I mean, yeah, I guess like if you're going for the original line outside of Game Boy Color, you don't want a Game Boy Advance. I mean, yeah, this is probably the best one of the original 3, the original Game Boy Pocket, and this is probably the best one to get. But why though? That's a very specific kind of person you are, where it's like, no, I don't want that, or that, or that, or that. I want an original Game Boy. They did one of these. But hey, I have one, and yeah, I love this thing as a novelty. I think it's a really cool piece.
Yeah. I think it was. But I just want to see side by side. Please, just compare the light.
Of Game Boy history that's oftentimes like never really talked about. Like, when was the last time you heard Nintendo themselves even reference this thing? So yeah,
Guys, I don't know if he like puts that rug on a table and then films like with the camera above him, or if he does it actually on his floor, bro. But it looks like it might be a table. That's fine.
probably out of most of the original Game Boys that I own, this might be one of my favorites, just on, you know...
Because he would need to be kneeling right there, bro, in order for it to actually... or to record. Alright, guys. Like, comment, subscribe, check out Scott's stash in the description. So weird, it never got released outside Japan. Yeah. Alright, thank you for watching, guys.